I'm really thrilled to introduce Camilla Gibb, who I've known professionally and as a friend for, oh God, one hates to do the math at a certain point in life, but I think it's about 12 years. She's really, truly one of Canada's finest literary writers. You probably know some of this, but I'll recap it a bit. She's written 4 magnificent novels, the most recent one of which is the Beauty of the Humanity Movement, which a reviewer in the UK compared to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, so not bad. Camilla is, these are books that have been critically acclaimed and internationally welcomed and read very, very widely. She's a very, very accomplished writer, and this has been recognized in awards, the Trillium Book Award, the City of Toronto Book Award, and she's been shortlisted for the Giller. She has an interesting educational background, which bears mentioning: an anthropology and Middle Eastern studies degrees from the University of Toronto, as well as a PhD in social anthropology from Oxford. What's coming in 2015 is a memoir, and I think she's going to read from that tonight. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'd like you to ask you to join me in welcoming Camilla Gibb.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you very much for coming. First off, I want to say thanks to the Peter Wall Institute. It's an exquisite environment in which to find yourself. And I want to thank Jenna Sarah, who extended this invitation quite some time ago, and Nancy Galini for hosting me so graciously, and everyone in the office who's been remarkable in terms of organization and just making me feel completely at home. I do have some papers because I got nervous. So sometimes I have to write out everything, so you'll forgive me. I'll do my best. I wanted to start by saying that I think I've heard this commonly said, that novelists are writing the same novel over and over again. They are populating it with different characters, they're telling different stories, creating different scenes, but in fact they're working out the same issue, the same problem, and they appear not to tire of it. And it seems though it was never obvious to me at the time. I think it's only obvious perhaps when you begin to have a body of work, or when graduate students begin to read your work and then they tell you what it is you were up to, that I persistently seem to be mining this theme of where we belong. I often look at people who don't feel they belong and ask the question of where is home? How do we build meaningful attachments in our lives? How do we cultivate a sense of community? Where do we land? I know now how true it is that my novels seem to be about this, because I've just written a memoir about the very same thing. So apparently my own life bears these questions. And I wanted to start today by reading the first couple of pages of that memoir as a way of leading me into talking about a bigger topic under consideration, that of empathy. I understand empathy as both the capacity to feel the feelings of another and the experience of entering into another's emotional world. I think of it as the means through which we identify and connect with others, and it's a critical part of our experience of ourselves as people in a social world. This subject of empathy is a really hot commodity right now, particularly so in the world of neuroscience. The scientific research tends to focus on mirror neurons, which were identified and described in the 1990s and are still the subject of much debate. A simple description of your mirror neurons at work would be that you see someone else break their arm and you wince. In fact, what's happening neurologically in your brain is the same mirror neurons are firing as if you were breaking your own arm in that moment, which I think is quite remarkable. So while these conversations have been moving about the ether in the world of neuroscience, it's led me to ask certain questions about almost the implicit role that empathy has played in the disciplines in which I've practiced, which are both social anthropology and literature, and wanting somehow to make what is implicit explicit as a way, I suppose, of participating, or at least being able to try to participate in a conversation that I think is of critical importance. I certainly know that empathy has been a critical component in my life as a reader. It's allowed me so much in the way of vicarious experience beyond my own. And also as a writer, though not necessarily in the sort of straightforward way that you might imagine. It's actually been situations of empathic failure on my part that have made writing fiction necessary, or at least the awareness of that failure. But as a preface to that bigger conversation, I wanted to read from the beginning. I never expected to be happy, to have a sense of belonging somewhere. I didn't grow up with a sense that this was possible or even desirable. I come by this honestly. I'm quite sure my parents didn't either. Still, they did try and find a way out of what was unhappy. 40-something years ago, they hatched a plan to escape their English lives. They felt stifled in England, trapped by the expectations of family, of class. They drew up an alphabetical list of Commonwealth countries, ruling out Australia because of a slight penal twinge, and chose Canada as the place to immigrate with my brother and me, 2 children under 4. We were too young to understand what was happening. My father came over a year in advance in order to find a job and a place for us to live. I cried when this strange man lifted me up at the airport. 3 months after our arrival, a package arrived from my paternal grandmother. She was a great maker of fudge and had sent us a box of it. I remember the sense of anticipation as my mother peeled back the lid and the collective disappointments as the contents were revealed, green and furry, having spent 6 weeks on a ship. I understood somehow that something between here and there had been broken. We had no history here, no story of belonging. And this disorientation didn't suit my father. He was a rule-bound, rigid, public school-educated former British Army officer who'd been thrown out of the military for his insult of a black superior. Despite his desire to immigrate to a freer world, his beliefs about race, class, women, and children just became more entrenched in Canada, more entrenched and more obviously peculiar. I knew he was odd. I knew to tread carefully in order to avoid being the target of his not infrequent outbursts, but I loved him very much. He scrambled eggs for me, took me swimming and biking, and he played the violin and the guitar. He did puzzles with me and made me look things up in a dictionary. He called me a boisterous girl, a hoyden. He built things out of wood. I loved the smell of sawdust on him and the feeling of his cheeks clean-shaven. I loved him even when I was embarrassed by or scared of him, and I think I was the only one. Shortly after our arrival in Canada, he was diagnosed as being an egomaniac without empathy or regard for others. This by a psychologist hired by his employer to do an assessment of him for some undisclosed reason. My mother tells me my father was enormously proud of this characterization, so much so, he actually sent a copy of the report home to his parents. A report that pretty much ended his formal working life. After that, it was a series of failed attempts to start a business, that and a lot of drinking and not always getting out of bed. My mother must have decided she'd had enough. When I was 9, my father went away on a business trip. We went to visit him in Chicago over the March break, and he asked my mother if she liked the dining room table and the chairs he'd just bought. That furniture told me everything I needed to know. I didn't need to stand outside the next day staring at a half-frozen pond having my father spell it out for me. But I didn't want him to be apart from us. I worried he would be lonely, and I was worried I would be lonely too. We went back to the apartment where my brother was so thrilled with the news of their imminent divorce that he was jumping up and down on the bed. My father tended to reserve his cruelest outbursts for my brother. He often referred to him as that boy, as if to distance himself from their association. He'd take out my mother at the same time. What's wrong with that boy meant he doesn't get that from my side. They were a pair in my father's eyes, and so were we. But from here on, the balance would shift. That same year, a new man, the antithesis of my thin, clean-shaven father, appeared in our lives. Again, I knew what was going on before I was told because of a piece of furniture. My mother took us to an apartment downtown where she was picking up a wooden chest she said she was buying from a friend of a friend. The apartment smelled of incense and cigarettes. The man was dark, swarthy, and very, very hairy. He had scars on his face, and he spoke loudly with an accent. I was the racist product of my father, and this man in his hip-hugging flared Levi's and collarless white shirt was being all too familiar with my mother. My brother bounced around the place. I crossed my arms over my chest and stood firmly rooted by the door. I didn't utter a word. Ara moved into our house not long after. He was 28 years old, my mother 40. As soon as he arrived, he tossed out the single beds my parents had always slept in and built a double bed. I thought this was completely immoral. He planted tomatoes and marijuana in the backyard. He was an actor, which wasn't a real job because he didn't wear a suit and go to an office. Not that my father had gone to an office in a very long time. Worst of all, he was openly affectionate with my mother. I didn't like it at all. I didn't like the changes in the house or the changes I saw in my mother. Everything felt slippery and loose, and I missed my father. I felt sorry for him, drunk and crying and living alone and moving constantly. I saw my brother, who had always been terrified of our father, embrace this new man without hesitation. In fact, everyone did, everyone but me. I kept vigilant, bitter watch for over a year. Then one weekend, when we were visiting the farm of a friend of my mother's, that changed. I'd spent the day swimming solitary laps across the pond, while Ara, my brother, and a host of other children ran around naked and rolled down the muddy bank. That night there was a wrestling match where Ara was taken on by the combined forces of 4 children. From my vantage point on the stairs, as the other children shrieked with delight and pinned him down, I found myself overwhelmed by a surge of proprietary feeling. It actually plays out filmically in my memory, in slow and continuous motion. When he was seated again, I stood up, and everyone was silent as I walked across the room toward him. And I slid into his lap, and I glared at the other children, because he was mine, he belonged to me, and the rest of them could just back the F off. Suddenly, the world brightened. It was brighter than it had ever been. Ara cooked and yelled and danced in our kitchen. He brought noise and color into our world as if firecrackers were being let off inside the house. He invited his acting friends over for long dinners, and the kitchen was full of food and laughter and wine and smoke. I don't remember my parents ever having had anyone over for dinner. There were moments of a kind of happiness, of freedom that I'd never experienced before. The 4 of us together in bed on Saturday mornings, my mother and Ara reading the paper, my brother and I the comics. There was silliness and play. Ara was Armenian, and he had grown up in Beirut. We learned about the Armenian struggle. He cultivated in us a taste for kibbeh and baba ganoush, and we accumulated a vast arsenal of Arabic words, particularly the ones for the naughty bodily bits and what one could do with them. Many of these dishes and profanities are still part of my diet and vernacular, even though the man himself is long gone. He left after just 2 years of living with us. He squatted on my bedroom floor one night and said things that were probably profound. Crying, he handed me a cheap Avon ring, obviously designed for someone with grown-up hands. He was gone the next day. His Ravi Shankar and Arlo Guthrie albums remained in a box in the basement. There was little in the way of explanation. But of course, Ara never really left me. His influence upon me was profound in ways I wouldn't even begin to understand until much later. He truly opened up the world. He taught me about things like exodus and genocide and discrimination and racial and cultural stereotyping, my own included. He also taught me about resilience, and he taught me about joy. And I think because of him, I really started to dream of other places that weren't English, where people were happy and life was meaningful. And I didn't find a kind of a framework for that idea until I started studying social anthropology at university. Here, I thought I had found a discipline that at its broadest explored what it is to be human by looking at the different ways we live as humans in the world. And as undergraduates, we learned that the principal methodology was something called participant observation. And in some ways, I think the term is self-evident, although it remains vague and it was never truly defined in a way that was satisfactory. We weren't taught how you positioned yourself at this awkward junction between participant and observer. There was a kind of implicit assumption that you just got it. And this was true at graduate school as well. And I think perhaps it was a sensibility more than anything, a way of being in the world. And if you didn't possess it, I guess you'd find out at some point. Whatever it was, I knew that I possessed it, that sensibility. And I think I'd known it implicitly long before I ever stepped into an anthropology classroom. I think I had learned it, or through Ara. I'd learned that I could unlearn, that I could be open to confronting and unsettling my own biases and preconceptions, to letting go of whatever it was that stood between me and someone who lived a life different from my own. through exposure and relationship and immersion. And I wasn't sure. But I knew that I wanted to do a PhD in anthropology. I knew I wanted to do field research. I knew I wanted to situate myself elsewhere, have that experience. Long before that, though, when I was an undergraduate, I decided that the way to begin to test whether I was capable of that was to put myself in the most foreign environment possible. So I spent my third year at university in Cairo, studying Arabic and learning about Islam. And it was completely overwhelming, living in this heaving, seething city of 21 people and 21 centuries of history. It was utterly overwhelming and disorienting. That was to be expected. What I hadn't expected was that in returning home, I would feel even more disoriented in my own environment. I wouldn't know how to make sense of that year. I wouldn't know how to communicate about it. I wouldn't know where to put myself. I also didn't realize that it took about 3 months. There was a moment coming back from my fourth year where I remember looking up from the pavement and suddenly realizing I have not been looking up. I'd become so used to deflecting any kind of attention. This is the way you move as a Western woman through a Cairene street. But when I did look up, I remember seeing this woman, a young Ethiopian woman, and I knew something about her. She had just arrived in Toronto through a scholarship that had been granted by WUSC, World University Services Canada. And I gravitated toward her, I think for pretty selfish reasons, in fact. She looked just as alien as I felt. I wanted to know something about her story. I wanted to know something about the bigger world. I wanted to keep its bigness alive. And we became friends in a very sort of pragmatic sense at first. We would go to Kensington Market. There was an Ethiopian spice store, so she could recreate some of the dishes of home. We'd buy secondhand clothes together. She would come to my parents' house for dinner. She would cook for me in her residence room over a little Bunsen burner, which of course was completely, forbidden. I learned a tremendous amount from her, and I was so moved by her story, disturbed and moved. She, Agitu, is a member of an ethnic group called the Oromo, who actually make up half of the Ethiopian population, but historically they've been marginalized, despised, written out of the record, referred to as the Gala, or the uncivilized. And she'd grown up during a socialist dictatorship, the Mengistu regime, where a lot of the state violence was directed towards Agitu's people. Her 4 brothers had all spent time in prison, charged as being counter-revolutionary. And when Agitu found her own life in danger, the year after she graduated from university, she knew she had to flee. And she made her way 720 kilometers from Addis Ababa to the border of Kenya on foot. She was smuggled over the border in the back of a potato truck. She was promptly arrested, where she was accused of being a spy. And once her refugee claim, it took time, but once her refugee claim was accepted, she was placed in a refugee camp. And it was from there that she earned the scholarship that brought her to Canada. A couple of years after meeting Agitu, and because of meeting Agitu, I started my PhD. And in 1994, I went to Ethiopia. And I went to the eastern part of the country, which is not where Agitu was from. I went to a small walled Muslim city called Harar, and I lived with a Harari family. This family had 9 children, and they lived in a walled compound in a walled city. It feels much more like a North African city, like Fez or Marrakesh, perhaps, with central squares and then these rabbit warren-y, everything's whitewashed and little lanes between whitewashed walls. And the architecture was such that there was a room for the women in the family and a room for the men in the family on the other side of the courtyard. And there were these raised red earth platforms where we all slept and ate and lived out the daily life. I had to dress really modestly like the women around me. I wore a veil and trousers under my skirts. And every morning we rose with the call to prayer and passed a water jug between us in order to bathe. Every day, 3 times a day, we ate the same watery stew out of the same bowl with our hands. And after the first month, there was suddenly no meat in the stew any longer. And it was up to me to fight, like everybody else had to fight, for the one bone floating there for who got to suck out the marrow. So my status as a guest had elapsed by this point. Every day was a battle against rats and cockroaches and intestinal parasites. And the work I was doing, the research I was doing while I was there, I spent most morning visiting saints' shrines. This wasn't something I had come across much in the anthropological literature about Islam, but there were over 300 saints in this small walled city, with shrines dedicated to them, with congregations that would serve the saints. And I was interested in this kind of notion of local orthodoxy. Something that sort of more orthodox regimes today would consider idol worship and would consider heretical. Most of the afternoons, though, I had acquired a group of friends, and we would sit and chew chat, which is this mild narcotic leaf that's chewed widely throughout East Africa. It's one of those. It's a stimulant, but it leads people into kind of silent contemplation. That might be the politest way of putting it. I didn't get that at first, because you have to chew an awful lot of it. It's bitter, it's hard work, it's quite unattractive. And I didn't get it, so I would still be, for me it was a tremendous opportunity. I had a captive group of people and I would just interrogate, and at first they were willing to participate, and then there was a point at which they were like, could you just shut up? And then actually someone got more literal with his instruction. He ground up the cat leaves in a mortar and added some sugar and water and made a paste and slapped it on the inside of my cheek. And this is the way people without teeth consume chat, and it worked. I understood what this Merkana was about. And then with the second last call to prayer of the day, people would pray, and then they would make their way home. And that usually, this was the hour they called shir, the visiting hour. So you would wander in your kind of semi-drugged haze, paying visits to people on the way home. And in my neighborhood, I got very attached to a Christian family who lived in the neighborhood and had they were a very poor family with a daughter named Biscutti, thanks to a brief Italian occupation in the 1940s, who I became very attached to. And then there was a man who was an architect who'd worked in Jeddah next door, really interesting, educated man who was dying of something they called ground disease. And it would take me years before I understood that ground disease was a euphemism. They said that mites had entered his system, but in fact it was AIDS. Nobody was naming it as such at the time. And at night, the women would gather, women from the neighborhood, the mother, her elder daughters, me, her sister often, and I was working on a dictionary of this unknown language, and I was helping the kids with their English homework because they were all studying English at school. And we talked, we shared the triumphs and the tribulations of the day, and sometimes the news was worrying. We had, it was 1995. Mengistu had been overthrown in 1991. They were in a period of transitional governance. In 1995, they had the first democratic elections, which saw Melissa Nawi come to power. He died last year. He retained power for quite a long time. But there were bombs going off. We had a curfew of 6 o'clock. It was a heightened time politically. But all of this stuff was the stuff of daily life in this place. And none of it made its way into my thesis. That thesis was about sort of the facts and the analysis of the facts. It was not about the feelings. It was this impersonal, objective account of religious life in an Ethiopian town. And it earned me my PhD, but it left me feeling quite bereft, guilty, because people I knew, very educated Hararis, couldn't read this thing. It was written in a particular technical jargon that serves its own purpose within an academic setting, but were they to read it, I'm not sure they would have felt it was a reflection of the world in which they lived. I felt a sense of loss, too. And so for me, I don't think it's not unfamiliar, I think, to many people returning from the field and producing a thesis, but most people just get on with it. I was disturbed by it, and I thought, what do you do with all that stuff that doesn't go into the thesis? What happens to your sense of what it actually feels like to be in a place, to your relationships to the people in the field? How do you maintain those? And what about the intimate experience of having been there? Your sensory memory of it. What do you do with all of that? I didn't yet have an answer. I wanted to share. I knew that I wanted to talk to Agitu again. I knew I wanted to share something with her about that experience now that I had some understanding of her country in a more visceral way. She had left Canada and gone to California and had 2 daughters by this point. And I called her up and we spoke in part about whether she wanted to tell her story, whether we should embark on recording her kind of narrative at this stage, either for publication, but at a minimum for her daughters who were losing touch with their own Oromo history. They'd been born in the US. So I went to Palo Alto, where she now lives, and we dropped her kids off at daycare each morning, and we came back and sat at the kitchen table, and for 2 weeks we went through as chronologically as we could her story and recorded it, and I later transcribed it. There were elements of her story that she revealed that I had had no idea about. After her undergraduate, for instance, she went to university as an Oromo woman, and a lot of Oromos concealed their identity. She didn't, because her brothers were kind of proud Oromo nationalists. It was evident in her name that she was Oromo. The payback as an Oromo was she would be told exactly what her job would be graduating from university. And they sent her to this bureau, which was essentially the spy agency, and her job was going to be to spy against Oromo people, including her brothers. It was an appalling and untenable situation, and so what they did was first they sent her to Czechoslovakia for 2 years of espionage training. She tried several times to escape from these barracks. And when she returned, you know, she had to flee. She lasted 6 days in that job before she walked into the marketplace and traded her clothes with somebody and started to walk. So the fact that she had not felt free to share that earlier on, but I think one of the things that disturbed me most was when she talked about, when we got in the chronology up to that point where she began to describe her first year in Canada, the first year of our friendship when we had met. Because she said to me, "Do you know what I remember of that year?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "Nothing. I remember how scared I was. Just a knock on the door. She used to leave her residence room door open at night because she didn't want anybody to knock, because for her the idea of knocking was somebody who's going to take you out of your bed and you may well never be seen again, the way in which her brothers had been taken." And she said, "I remember how cold it was." She said, "I was a ghost. I felt like a ghost." And you know, it was in that moment when I realized that for all our years of friendship, which was a decade by this point, and for all I knew about her country, her people, their history, their culture, for all the research I'd done there and also here in the diaspora, I didn't know anything of what really mattered. That first year of our friendship, I'd been interested in everything I could learn from her, and also in helping her become more familiar with this place in tangible ways. And she talked about Ethiopia and her own past, and I was moved, I felt sympathetic, but I had completely failed to recognize or understand what she was experiencing in that present. I didn't feel what she felt. I didn't walk in her shoes. I didn't see the world the way she saw it. And for all the facts, I just didn't know the feelings. And for me, this was a complete failure of empathy on my part, which begs all sorts of questions about the one-sidedness of our friendship, but it also, for me, begs questions about the nature of the work I was doing as an anthropologist. It was a book written quite a long time ago called Writing Culture. Mary Louise Pratt wrote this essay called Fieldwork in Common Places. And she writes, "There are strong reasons why field ethnographers so often lament that their ethnographic writings leave out or hopelessly impoverish some of the most important knowledge they've achieved, including the self-knowledge. For the layperson, such as myself, the main evidence of a problem is the simple fact that the ethnographic writing tends to be surprisingly boring. How, one asks constantly, could such interesting people doing such interesting things produce such dull books? What did they have to do to themselves?" You know what, indeed. My particular education, which was a very English education, didn't encourage much in the way of self-reflexivity. Actually, to be honest, to be engaged in this way would have been seen as narcissistic and supremely self-indulgent. But when I reflect on all the years that I studied this subject, it seems to me that something critical was missing in terms of the discussion. And it goes back to that idea of sensibility. What is it? What is this sensibility that's required? I certainly never heard the word empathy used. It's too soft, it's too morally inflected, it may well be condescending, it's too namby-pamby, it's too do-goody, it's too nice. But being empathic isn't actually synonymous with being nice. In fact, when it's used as a methodological tool, it's a way of gathering information through identifying the feelings an experience evokes in yourself. In much the same way, I think, that psychoanalysis uses empathic resonance as a means of insight into somebody's internal world. Empathy, which I mean here is an emotional, thank you, or affective ability to share what someone is feeling, it's necessarily self-reflective. It's not only do you enter into another person's emotional world, you come to examine your own biases by situating yourself differently. So I couldn't find at that point a way within my own discipline or the language of my own discipline to share what someone, even a really good friend, was feeling. I found myself rebelling as a consequence. I started writing short stories. I started attempting somehow to communicate or make use of this material in a way, in a different way, through a different language. And honestly, the stories were terrible. None of them were ever published, thank God. I had a whole lot of unlearning to do first. I had to unlearn most of what I had been taught, I think. It's not dissimilar. People have said that anthropology and fiction are not, there are big similarities because both do demand standing at a certain remove in order to observe and make creative connections between actions and words. And both are struggling to find ways of representing human experience. Both also situate their agents on the periphery. It's been said that anthropology and literature are two disciplines which attract and cultivate outsiders because alienation is critical to their business. Alienation is a central theme of both literature and fieldwork experience. It's where fieldwork begins, the point from which we move toward familiarity, knowledge, understanding. There's a theoretician, Atto Kaysen, who's pointed out that alienation then disappears from the ethnographic text. It's expunged as fieldwork is turned into an object of scientific knowledge. To do otherwise is to risk being engaged in forms that are dismissed as dead-end self-indulgence and narcissism. This idea of alienation, I want to pause on the idea of alienation for a second because it tends to be a concept we talk about in this century and the previous century related to the rise of capitalism. But if we think about it not in an economic or a political sense, but in a philosophical sense, it speaks to the idea that the world is an object of perception, and to see it, therefore, is to be distanced from it, rather than living within it. And that certainly speaks to me as a writer. I often say to students and people interested in writing that to be too immersed is you will fail to see what it is you're trying to speak about. Doesn't make for necessarily a happy life, but you can make good use of the unhappy. That idea that alienation is the point from which we move towards familiarity, it leads me to ask, what's that mechanism then? What's the means by which that movement begins? How is a relationship between subject and object forged? I really think it is through empathy, and of an emotional or affective kind, not of a cognitive kind. That's a distinction that they do make in neuroscience. The emotional or affective empathy, the cognitive, understanding some theory of mind, and the motivational, which is the impulse to act. In neuroscience, the thinking is that a deficit in the emotional or affective places one on a spectrum of antisocial behavior, antisocial personality disorders, what we as lay people have tended to call the sociopathology or psychopathology. And then the cognitive deficit seems to be linked to autism spectrum disorders. Where Atto Kaysen says that alienation is expunged through the fieldwork, the conversion of your fieldwork into a text. This is where the writing begins to suffer, is in that process of conversion. Because conducting fieldwork, immersing yourself in a community and gaining some degree of trust and acceptance, it's as much an emotional exercise as it is a cognitive endeavor. But in the conversion of that research into text, it's that piece that's surrendered. It's the emotional or affective piece that's surrendered. And the risk, I think, in turning humans into objects of scientific knowledge then becomes these moments of empathic failure. I felt I needed a way to confront these kind of failures, and I would ultimately find it through fiction. I say to students, it's not simply write what you know. It's both write what you know and write what you want to know, and what you don't know. Because what you know actually is much. You've lived a life. You have all of that material to draw upon, but it's what you don't know that will really compel or drive you and lead you, hopefully, to new places of understanding. My first book, for instance, was driven by this same kind of question. It was driven by a need that I had to understand someone's experience that I couldn't get my head around. Somebody in my life, a man, had been sexually abused as a child. I knew him well, but I also knew his father well, the perpetrator in this case, and I couldn't get my head around it. And so I had to write a novel. I had to write mouthing the words and kind of live the experience of this character, and in order to be able to say that I understood at any real empathic level. Interesting enough, in that novel, which is very funny, a funny novel about sexual abuse, one of the bright spots in that novel is that the mother, after the parents separate, the mother meets this young Sikh doctor who moves into their house and throws out the single beds and builds a bed, a Sikh doctor. And so, Ara never left me. He came 20 years later. He comes up as a character, a minor character, but a hugely influential character in this story. I sent it to Ara. I found him. He lives in Vancouver. I sent it to him, and he was just astonished. He couldn't understand how it was that he'd had that kind of impact. He'd only been with us for 2 years after all. But that passage, sort of between 9 and 11 or 10 to 12 is critical, I think. It's when we first begin to have those questions and make sense of things. And he was flattered. But the odd thing was I was disappointed by the exchange because he was no longer Ara. He'd become David, and he chopped the Armenian suffix off his last name. And he had become an accountant. What right did I have to be disappointed? Well, of course, I remained invested in his foreignness, right? It was a kind of romance about his foreignness that had led me to be in foreign places. And then what had he been doing? Becoming anglicized and respectable and assimilated. But it was a kind of a hard lesson for me to realize, that is just as heroic as, dodging car bombs in Beirut. And, it's his life that he has to live. Like, it's not for me to maintain an investment in his otherness, which has caused him problems, So it's kind of the soft underbelly of racism that was at work there. My third novel took that into account. But it also, I think, most importantly, tried to wrestle with this question, this issue that Agitu had raised in her kitchen of feeling like a ghost, and my recognition that I had failed to understand that. So after all was said and done, I did write a novel that's dedicated to her, in part, Sweetness in the Belly. And it's set in Ethiopia during the last years of imperial rule, so much earlier than I was actually there. So the last years of Haile Selassie's empire. And then it's set in London in the 1980s amongst refugees who fled the dictatorship that comes to power after Haile Selassie's overthrown. And it's told from the perspective of a Muslim nurse. And it looks at how people are trying to rebuild their lives and build new meaningful networks and senses of identity in exile. And among them is a man named Yusuf. And Yusuf is finally being reunited with his wife, Amina, and Amina is, importantly, she's ready to get on with life, and he's been in prison for the last 7 years. He's not quite there. Maybe he won't ever be there. Another thing that Agitu taught me is you can't impose a template onto refugee experience. We come into this each with our own resources, our own histories, our own upbringing. And so the people who we see in this community are responding very differently to their experiences in exile. Once I finished that book, I sent it to Agitu, and I did so with considerable trepidation. And what she said to me was, that's the first time I've ever read a book and recognized and related to the stories. And she said, for me, it's not a fiction. What I found interesting, Yusuf is the character who stays with me most. Yusuf is actually a minor character, but he's the one who was having that ghost-like experience in London. And I think that's why he matters most to me, is it because it's closest to what Agitu was telling me about her own experience. Now, Yusuf is a man who's been in prison for 7 years. He's a devout Muslim. Agitu is not. She's a neo-Pentecostal from the other side of Ethiopia. And nevertheless, she felt that this fiction captured something of her truth that, that is hers, and that truth matters. Seeing yourself on the page matters. I say that as a reader. I'm sure every one of us has had that experience where you're reading a novel and you're being given insight into a character that strikes a profound chord in you, something you've never articulated or you've never actually seen represented elsewhere, something that you've thought or experienced but never expressed, or something that tells you you're not alone in what you think and feel, or something that tells you you're not invisible, or the history of a people like Agitu's is not invisible. I had to ask her how she felt about me, a white North American woman, writing this story, and she absolved me. She said that, what you possess is you're in a position of privilege, and you have the privilege of being able to shine a light into this dark corner. She said, for me as an aroma, if I were to write that story, I'd be in jail. And she said it confers a legitimacy on our struggle that other Ethiopian authorities will not like one bit. So it was an interesting way to look at it. And I think through Agitu, I discovered, maybe rediscovered, that fiction was, I think, one of the most powerful means of truth-telling. I think I really had just forgotten it because I'd grown up as a reader, being transported and immersed into other worlds, but I was educated to value intellectual inquiry at the expense of something which is critical to understanding the human subject. I guess the upside is that I was bothered enough by this to find some other means to write in search of correction, or in some search of some kind of emotional resonance that would bring me to something that felt closer to truth. There are plenty of studies that suggest that reading fiction increases our understanding of the feelings of others. These studies usually do make a distinction, though, between, I often get trashed for this. I wrote a piece in the Globe, I don't know if anybody saw it, but where I refer to genre this week, and where I refer to genre writers, I got myself into trouble. There's been a bit of a genre writer backlash. But the studies that look at understanding the feelings of others have focused on literature, because, unlike genre fiction, literature actually demands more of the reader. It leaves more space for the reader to project his own understanding, and it demands a kind of participation, where genre fiction tends to give you more and require a bit less. It entertains you more. So neuroscientists have taken a particular interest in the way in which literature can serve as a way of encouraging empathy. So Jamil Zaki, who's somebody I was in touch with when I was thinking about this paper, he's a psychologist and director of the Stanford Neuroscience Lab. He wrote a piece in Scientific American where he cites a recent study that found college students' self-reported empathy has declined since 1980, with an especially steep drop in the past 10 years. And it's impossible to pinpoint why, but it's not impossible to speculate, and he certainly does. Greater social isolation seems one likely suspect, but so does the decline in reading. The number of American adults who read literature for pleasure sank below 50% for the first time in the last 10 years. And that decrease was measured most sharply amongst university-age adults. So it's a suggestive parallel. It's suggestive and it's compelling, and I think it should concern us all deeply. What interests Emil Zaki and other neuroscientists like him about that study is that if you see a generational shift in people's sense of their empathy, it seems to conflict with studies that suggest empathy is a fixed trait you're born with or not. Is it malleable? This is what this would suggest. And this is the million-dollar question in the realm of neuroscience. Because if it's malleable, then, well, first of all, it should be possible to encourage and cultivate more of it. Thus far, any kind of interventions to teach empathy really have not proven particularly successful, but they tend to deal with people kind of at the margins of the empathic spectrum, repeat sexual offenders, for example. What about the rest of us, making the assumption here? There's enough evidence to suggest that, while neuroscience carries on probing and seeking some kind of understanding about what's happening in the brain, we could all be exercising the very same neurons by just reading more, which is a simple prescription, and a self-evident prescription. I think where we begin to see a departure is in terms of the end goal, really, because with neuroscience, the end goal would lie in its corrective potential. If you identify a neurotransmitter or a neuron or a gene, presumably you can alter it, which is where things start to get ethically complicated and our interests really diverge. Because I think for me, the issue of the generational drop in empathy and the question of its malleability really lead me, as someone with an interest in both the humanities and social sciences, to the question of how we cultivate in ourselves and in successive generations, how we engage and cultivate socially responsible citizens. So my simple prescription, I think at a minimum literature is in the good habit of reminding us of our humanity across time and space. And on occasion, reading literature is like holding a mirror up to ourselves, revealing something of our interior lives. On other occasions, we're making these giant imaginative leaps into the world of another, where someone's experience, as different as it might be from our own, we can still see the kind of common parallels and struggles in terms of seeking attachment and meaning in our lives. That idea of the necessity of stories that locate us in time and space, that's a central theme in the memoir that I've been writing. That idea that we had no history here, no story of belonging, and there was no narrative, and there was no narrative even beyond it. Somehow there was no narrative about where we were supposed to go from that point, how life was supposed to unfold. Partly because I didn't grow up in a house of stories. My parents were not storytellers, but I grew up in a house of books. And I mean, maybe my mother wisely understood that storytelling was not her forte, and so she pointed me toward the bookshelf. I remember I used to stand in front of that bookshelf and say, "Mummy, what's suitable for children?" And she'd pull them off. And sometimes I would read adult things that just had no sex or violence in them, so they were still lost on me. And then, of course, it was more exciting to read the things that she had deemed unsuitable. And I learned shocking things from the likes of, D.H. Lawrence and Günter Grass and John Irving, and that is truly where I got my education. So that's where I'll stop today. Thank you for listening.
I'm sure there are questions from the floor, so I think the rule is that you have to hold the mic. Is that correct? So maybe just hand it around, but I welcome questions.
Question at the back.
You spoke about bad anthropology. The short question is, what about bad literature? And then to extend the question a little bit, I study anthropology, and I can think of some very good anthropology.
Yeah.
Just to name off a work, Jean Briggs' Never in Anger is an incredibly empathetic work.
Mm-hmm.
What about good cinema? What about good art? I think that maybe what you're talking about is the idea of being or feeling cultured. Is that maybe the gist of your sort of narrative?
Being, feeling, culture. I mean, I think the thing, I'll try and answer that, or respond to that, not answer it. But I think the thing that distinguishes literature from good or bad, from sort of other media, film, music, I think it's the most intimate exchange that occurs. It's more intimate than reading beautifully written ethnography. I agree there is some beautiful ethnography and some beautiful writing. It's more intimate. It's a completely private consumption, you know, and it's not a passive experience. It's more intimate than, I think, than any other medium. I probably shouldn't say that. That's my experience of it. Perhaps that is true for others of music. What about the question of good and bad and the kind of the value judgments? I mean, it's not to say that there isn't beautiful ethnography out there, but it's not going to speak widely. It's not going to speak as widely as I wanted anthropology to speak, because I think important work happens. But the limitations, I mean, it's important work, but it has to be theoretically contextualized in such a way that you can contribute to an argument that is quite sophisticated, that really only a handful of people are going to be literate in. So it's beautiful in its own space, but it doesn't communicate as widely as I wanted it to. Feeling culture. I asked a couple of anthropologists. I spoke at Casca this year. There's a Center for Imaginative Ethnography at York University, and they put on this panel, and they tried to, the people who participated tried to write in an unconventional way about their material. They did it as short story, they did it as kind of personal, creative nonfiction. It wasn't an entirely successful experiment, because I think, you know, to be immersed in that world and in that language, it's really hard. I mean, I had to separate myself completely. I had to unlearn the passive voice. I had to dare to actually say I had my own opinion, you know, or to say something without reference to citations and quotations. That felt like completely wrong. I had to find ways to evoke a sense of place that appealed to the senses, whereas in my own anthropological work that would have been considered really exoticizing. There was such a move against the exotic. There's so much unlearning I had to do. I had to write 2 novels before I could even touch. I had to basically, you know, mine my own family, exploit my own family, destroy my own family. As Philip Roth says, a writer is born into a family and the family is done. Before I could come back to that material. And yeah, maybe it is about even talking to anthropology students though, at Casca, I asked them, do we ever use the words empathy? And they said there's a bit of work on compassion, but it's often a critique of compassion, because compassion can be seen as, you know, what I can offer you is, you know, there's something patronizing in that exchange. Just a few thoughts in response.
I love your fiction, and I'm just curious. Sweetness in the Belly, of course, as you've referred to, was written some period after, but you lived some of the life experience, and certainly it was the subject for your PhD thesis or aspects of it. And it's certainly something that really immerses the reader in the culture. Beauty of the Humanity Movement, I thought was such a different novel. But set in Vietnam and really exploring, as you say, some of the same themes, but it really was a really, really different novel to me, and I also loved it. But I'm just curious about how you view the difference of having sort of lived the life and immersed yourself versus doing the research and trying to understand and situate yourself in Vietnam.
Right. After I wrote Sweetness in the Belly, I was nervous for all sorts of reasons, having written it. You know, what kind of charges of appropriation would come my way? Who would I piss off, basically? Who was I? and I thought, I'll never write a story about another culture again. Like, I knew something about that place in a visceral way, having lived there, that I could never possibly recreate. You know, the older, I was never going to be 25 again and go and live in a community and just, you know, throw myself in the deep end the older I got. I knew that. And so it really bothered me. You don't sort of choose your stories, they kind of choose you. It really bothered me when I went to Vietnam in 2007. I was working on another novel. I didn't go looking for inspiration. I just went there for a holiday. And then what happened? Somebody told me a story. And I had to go home and write this man into being. And all the research I had to do in that case was, you know, some of it was I looked at ethnography that existed, and I just read an awful lot, and then I had questions, I went back to Vietnam, but I knew I was never going to have the same immersive experience. And I knew I was taking even more of a risk in doing this, but I was pretty clear about the fact that what I was doing was probably not for a Vietnamese audience. It was probably largely for a North American audience who still had, we have images of Vietnam that are so static. We still see it as you know, a portrait of war. It's our own narrative that has shaped our vision of this place, where of course that was a considerably long time ago. More than half the population was born after the war. It's a dynamic, kind of ferocious economy. And as one tour guide said to me, look, the American war, which immediately shifts the perception of it, the American war was 10 years. We were occupied for 1,000 by the Chinese, and for 80 years we were treated like slaves in our own country by the French, and kind of putting it into perspective. So here was another story that I felt like, well, this is a story that needs to be heard, a kind of a portrait of contemporary Vietnam that in Western literature I haven't seen represented. So it was kind of a different project in some ways. But I knew, like I thought to myself, but you're not going to learn the language. Like, I'm done. I'm not learning any other language. It's full, right? And so I would never know. I would never understand and feel how it is I felt in Sweetness in the Belly. And I think it's, you know, it's a kind of competent novel, like all the parts work, but it doesn't have the same depth. I mean, I think that's true, and I sort of say to myself, don't travel anymore, don't go on holidays anymore, you know. Yeah.
Why are you turning to write memoir after writing novels? I mean, one of your statements is that there's more truth in fiction than in anything else.
And memoir, of course, employs all sorts of interesting narrative techniques, you know, and what is truth in memoir. It was I've never had a problem sort of writing. I mean, no, I've not sort of run into walls. I've written bad things that I've chosen not to publish, including whole novels. But I kept writing, and there was a point in my life where things suddenly were not what I expected. And we all probably have these moments in our lives where you just go, and it was beyond language. Like, I didn't have words for it. I didn't know how to, it shocked me that words left me. I felt abandoned by language. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a journalist at the time and saying, he said, just write it down, if you can get words down about what is happening in the now, write it down. So that's what I started doing, but just in, you know, journal form. And then it became an occasion, because I was just so surprised and taken by this change in circumstances in my life. It became an occasion to look back and ask the question, well, how did I get here? It's not framed in that way. It's not like the inciting incident leads to the reflection. In fact, it's framed in a kind of chronological way about stories, and especially about narratives of family. And it has a happy ending, so. It's called This Is Happy.
Well, thank you so much, Camilla. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.